begin at the beginning with the very first poem that is in my book, Simply to Know Its Name. It's the poem that gives the collection its title, and it's called Steelheading. Into the storm-dark Sacramento I waded again and again that winter, casting spoons on fine line with a willowy rod, threading the lures deep among the bottom stones, around sunken snags, seeking steelhead, till the water iced my wadered legs to stone and drove me back up the bank, shivering. Hour upon hour, day upon day I fished, and no fish. But when it came, it was a locomotive run away on a downgrade, black and fast and roaring steam, stripping off line against the drag in a high, clear singing. The fish was on perhaps 5 headlong seconds, rose up and spat the spoon back, a luminous orange bullet coming straight at my nose. The pulsing in my chest, the sharp, coppery taste in my mouth lifted the bone chill of untallied days, working the spoon to the bottom among the rocks and roots, which is the whole story. You are heading way out and deep down, a bright bit tipping the thinnest tether, when something big hits, and you feel blessed simply to know its name. The feeling that this poem is meant to evoke is awe. Now, unfortunately, the word awe has been diluted by pop culture's endless and trivializing use of it, as in, have a bagel, they're awesome. The movie was just awesome. There's even a Christian rock song with the refrain, our God is an awesome God, which when you think about it, makes for a really weird theology. Fortunately, I'm a poet, not a theologian, so I don't have to go there. But what I'll do is what poets really like to do, which is to unpack a word to see what it is carrying. What are the stories? What are the meanings that are hidden inside of it? You take the word awe and you trace it back in both Old English and archaic Greek, and it describes a very complex emotion that comprises both terror and surprise. It arises when you walk into the presence of something much bigger than you are, and you confront the realization that this world, this cosmos we are a part of, dwarfs us. Awe revolves around a recognition of the other, of presences whose existence we recognize but cannot explain, and which we certainly do not condemn. And that's why it is, when you're in a state of awe, you feel blessed simply to know its name. Awe mixes fear with surprise, and I really went for this particular complex mixing of emotions in a poem called Timber Rattlesnake. The timber rattlesnake's scientific name is Crotalus horridus, which really gets this, even the sound. In Latin, it means a ringer that stands your hair on end. The poem is set in the Appalachian corner of Ohio, where some hill country Christians handle poisonous snakes in church. Timber rattlesnake. As slow as dark water, the snake esses across the old trail's roots and rocks. I slap my staff in front to watch it coil, shudder at its fierce buzz. This sound makes me a boy again, the catcher who stalked south ledges for garters, blacks, hognoses. Rattlesnakes went to true believers who caught the serpents to handle in church, a show of faith raised over flesh and saved from venom. I knew better than to pick rattlers up, left them where they lay in brown banded coils on gray limestone, that rattle bristling scalp and neck and goosebumping all my skin, ringing out such wild fear, so animal, so unsaved. Now, to encounter awe, you don't necessarily have to have a really dramatic event like encountering a rattlesnake on a hiking trail in the Hocking Hills of Ohio, or going steelhead fishing and waiting for the fish to finally hit. A lot of times, it really arises simply from paying really close attention to everything that is around you, to something small until it blossoms into something bigger. Poetry is really good at doing this. It's really good at going from the specific and the small into the universal and the cosmic. That wonderful quatrain we did from William Blake about eternity in an hour and a heaven in a grain of sand is very much about that, where he is able to look at very ordinary objects and take them all the way out into their cosmic and universal significance. This is a poem, and it's not as good as Blake's, called Opening, which takes place on the other side of Ohio. All night the wind pounded tribal drums, beat against windows and roofs, roused Lake Erie into dancing ranks of water. When morning arrived, bright, domesticated, I walked the pier, found it cobbled with clams tossed up by the thousands. Blue-black, glistening, they opened a blade's width as they died, offering slim insight into the soft wet within. Over them hung this smell, unseasoned and raw, the scent of secrets that live under our eyes and noses until a wild music draws them out. This is all can arise from following the scent of secrets. It's about paying attention to the world as it reveals itself. And attention, if you think about it, is actually a form of reverence. And the task of paying attention which often falls to the mystics. It's about those folks who pay very close attention to where the small and the specific around us open into the mysterious, the cosmic, and the universal. I suspect we have all experienced mystical moments, and we know that these particular little brief interludes of cosmic time are ineffable. That is, that they lie somewhere beyond and below words. When Orpingalik, the Inuit shaman, whose statement Gail read, describes where his songs come from, he made this point really, really clearly. He said, songs are thoughts which are sung out with the breath when people let themselves be moved by great force, and ordinary speech no longer suffices. Notice that. When you are moved by great force, an ordinary speech no longer works. And we, who think of ourselves as small, feel even smaller. And we will hesitate before using words, but it will happen that the words that we need will come up of themselves. When the words that we need come up of themselves, we have a new song. Orpingalik's song, which is the form of poetry that existed in that pre-literate Inuit culture he lived in northern Canada, he's trying to talk about a mystical experience. His songs are translating that. And often mystics, like Orpingalik, turn to poetry in order to somehow grasp the experience they have been through. Prose, with its linearity, doesn't work very well. You can talk about it, but you can't convey it. It is, for example, no literary accident that if you take a good close look at the Old Testament, that the books of the Psalms, most of the books of prophecy, and many of the books of wisdom are written in poetic form. There was even one poem in the Old Testament, the Song of Songs, which is frankly erotic, which never even mentions the name of the divine. And it's in there because those particularly smart scholars who were putting together the Old Testament realized they couldn't leave it out. It was too good. That's how powerful poetry can be in conveying that kind of experience. You notice that today's hymns include words from any number of mystics who turned to poetry in order to express their experience. We've had William Blake, we've had Rumi, and we've had St. Francis of Assisi, who is Rumi's Christian counterpart. Francis, who is one of my absolute favorite saints, and I was raised Catholic, so that's a statement of no small meaning. He figures into this poem, Snow Bunting, which takes place on the western shore of Hudson Bay in northern Canada. And the snow bunting has another one of those absolutely wonderful Latin names, Plectrophaenax nivalis, which in Latin means feathered trickster of the snows. From the tall steel of a tundra buggy's deck, I spotted 2 prowling polar bears leave willow rills for the water's edge, where they chased and rolled, then dropped into a nap amid the dark wrack wreathing that icy beach. Through the binoculars, I could see their noses flute, bowed ribs rise with each breath, while around them, sparrow-sized snow buntings hopped, whistled, and foraged, stood in the nostrils' turning breeze, traced the still flanks, braved even the black curve of seal-smashing paws. They pranced without fear of fierce power, like jester dwarves in the king's court, or Francis at play before God, singing praises of the small. See, awe is the area that spirituality and poetry share. It's the place where Francis at play before God sings praises of the small. It's the place where Emily Dickinson can turn so cold at the reading of a poem that she thinks no fire will ever warm her, or that the top of her head has been torn off. That's exactly what she's talking about. It's about Orpingalik, too, when he says that the words we need come of themselves. We live in a prosaic culture. We think of prose as being the normal. And in fact, poetry is a lot older. It reaches way, way far back into our origins. It has ancient roots in music and in ritual. And you can hear that in those poetic forms that use musical rhythms and rhyme. And they do that for 2 fundamental reasons. One is that in a pre-literate culture, we had to memorize everything. Having words that rhymed and or had a precise meter were much easier to memorize than free verse. It's really hard to memorize Allen Ginsberg. It's much easier to memorize William Blake, much, much easier. And that's not a trivial distinction, and it has a lot to do with how it functions. But the other thing that's about that is that the sheer musicality, the physicality of poetry is one of those things that helps you create a whole body experience in the hearing of a poem. Poetry is not journalism. It doesn't report on something. It creates the experience. It actually evokes sensation through imagistic language. I wrote this poem, What Breathing Means, after a boat trip to San Ignacio Lagoon in Baja California. And this is one of the areas where gray whales both mate and breed. What breathing means. On a midnight so dark it made light seem a fantasy, I stood blind in the anchored boat's bow and listened. Coyotes hunting far off sang like a gospel choir. One animal led, others answered, call and response crisscrossed the desert. Nearby, a gray whale surfaced and blew. Its exhalation exploded like 1,000 stallions snorting as one. Then the whale sucked air down, drew in the windy drone of those hoarse hundreds filling hot lungs. Another whale blew and breathed, and another, yet another, and one more. The breath beat of a herd aroused, immense and wild. Out and in went on and on, coyotes sopranoed above, while I melted into breath, into song. You remember how Orpingalik said, and then it will happen that we, who always think of ourselves as small, feel even smaller. This, to me, is the key lesson that awe teaches us. It makes us really small because we are part of an extraordinarily large and mysterious cosmos that we really don't grasp. And at some point, we will sort of fold and melt back into it. As in that poem, I melted into song. Some years ago, on a raft trip on the South Nahanni River in northern Canada, only about 400 miles south of the Arctic Circle, I came across a story about melting that became this poem. It's entitled, The Woman Who Ran Toward Heaven. People up here do this. They go missing wildly, the way May Lafferty did. She took off in the fall on a hunting trip with in-laws in the country where Flat River spills into the Nahanni. While the others went upriver with their rifles and an eye for moose, May abandoned tents and canoes, racks of meat smoking over slow fires. The hunters returned to cold coals, coffee waiting to boil in blue enamel pot, ribs and hams well shy of cure. The in-laws circled the camp and called May's name. Beyond their own voices, only silence. Native Dene trackers lent their practiced eyes to the search, picked up the trail of clothing May dropped like puzzle pieces of the life she was racing to leave. The farther she went, the more intimate the blazes. The trackers topped ridges and crossed streams until they knew she was crashing naked through the infinite spruce, leaving only bare footprints that grew fewer by the mile. In time and distance, all trace of her faded. This happened decades ago. Yet, as the rafts pass the mouth of May Creek, I can see her lying still in the open somewhere upstream and upslope. Rain drops between her ribs in spring and fall. Mice nibble the fine bones of her hands all summer. Snow fills the pan of her pelvis come winter. Even now, the land continues the gentle work of folding her sudden wildness in. We live in a synthetic built environment that's a long, long way from the wilderness of northern Canada. And as a result of that, our occasions of awe can be few and far between. And that creates a situation in which poetry becomes more difficult, at least the kind of poetry I'm writing. And it also makes it harder and harder for spirituality to flourish. And when there is no awe and there's no mystery, there's no spirituality and there's no poetry. So I want to conclude this sort of sermon, sort of reading, with the very last poem in Simply to Know Its Name. It is one dedicated to my sons, Darren and Brian. I wrote it, almost 25 years ago, at a time when they were schoolboys, and I was particularly concerned about the awe-challenged world they were growing up into. And truth be told, I still am, but when I see the young men they have grown into, I feel some small faith that this poem worked and that poetry can, in fact, turn tides. The poem's title is Their Gathering. My boys harvest from a mountain streamside the remembering bones of this hour, green and wet, off by ourselves, splashing and laughing, last season's darkening acorns, twiggy sticks and straws of grass washed down in spring flood, a small rock shaped, they testify, like a Lego lost long ago. They consider, too, a green-sided tree frog, only as big as a thumbnail, hopping from slick bank to tumbling water with clear amphibian resolve. Then let it flee into its rippling peace. At home, I know, they will set their treasures in the place of treasures, alongside the older others, and move, as boys do, ahead of memory toward the next new light. Still, I pray they will recall, grown years from now, this moment of endless gathering, their surrender to water and earth and a small frog's power, even as their bodies race into manhood, even as the world of zeros orders them to turn their backs on it all.